Welcome to the Indigenous Voice. This is the first show, and we would like to do a little bit of description about our new show. But before doing anything and saying anything, we would like to, after the first acknowledgement we have another acknowledgement for Jack Atkins and his role in inspiring people to work in community TV. So from our show, Indigenous Voice, we would like to say thanks, Jack. And we know you are now under the weather, and we know your energy will be back soon. Thanks. In this show, we have our first guest is, we have here Beck Peacock, and he's a screenwriter for a film called Emerald and Grey. Welcome, Beck, to our show.
Thank you.
Thanks. Would you please give us a little bit introduction about your background?
Well, yeah, I taught at the University of San Diego and Palomar College for many, many years, retired. I taught film studies as chairman of the department there. I've also been an author. I wrote a textbook on film called The Art of Movie Making, Script to Screen. I wrote a book on divorce called Learning to Leave, which is a different aspect of life, but it was a bestseller in its little niche. And I've written, I've produced and directed a documentary called Petals, Journey into Self-Discovery, which did international film festivals, Vancouver Film Festival, and so on. So I've been involved with film and writing scripts. I've written 2 other scripts besides the one here, and so it's in my life.
And how you come across the residential school story?
Residential school, well, like a lot of people, I guess, in the sense that very little was known in the popular culture until 3 or 4 years ago, when it started coming out in the press regularly, and now it's in the press all of the time. And as I caught up with the whole situation of residential schools in Canada, I was, like a lot of people, shocked, interested, embarrassed that I didn't know more. And the more I thought about it, the more I got involved in it, the more research I started doing into it, I realized that it was a big hole in the Canadian culture, Canadian history. I remember recently hearing Pierre Trudeau say, when they talked about residential schools and the whole situation that happened with the Indigenous people, First Nation people, that he remembers seeing 2 or 3 short paragraphs in a history book that he had when he was going to school. And to me, hearing that, it would be like in the United States, having the subject of slavery or something, being a little footnote in a history book. This is an extremely important part of Canadian history, and it had been ignored, submerged, forgotten. And I feel that it's very important to get that story out. The stories come out certainly in the research being done by the reconciliation committees. But those kinds of works, and I've got the volumes myself, and I've studied them very well, but they don't get read by people. There have been there have been several very good documentaries on the subject of the residential history of the residential schools. But like a lot of documentaries, they are a niche kind of, get a niche audience. Sometimes they connect very strongly, but they tell a different story that I'm telling, because I'm attempting to tell a story that's a dramatic narrative, in other words, a feature film, and that tells a very it tells a different story. It tells a story from a different angle.
So what is the nature of the project?
Well, what I've attempted to do, and I think I've achieved it, is tell the story that has to be told in a very personal way, the way a narrative film does. A documentary will tell a story, give you the facts from the outside, the exterior. They'll give you the facts and figures, and it can be very, very powerful. But a narrative drama forces, in a sense, the viewer to live the life of the people in it. You're living subjectively in the world of the participants that you're writing about. In my case, I found it at first difficult to approach as a screenwriter. Difficult because when you get into the story of what happened in residential schools, the stories are dark, grim, and they just get grimmer. They just get darker because as much as you want to explore and express and expose what happened, it is so cruel that for a screenwriter who's doing fiction, I mean a narrative film, you need another angle. You can't start at the bottom and go down. And that's what it felt like when I got into it.
But isn't it like a kind of just a small chapter of a bigger story, the colonial?
This is a small chapter, and I did choose a particular time and place. Actually, right here in British Columbia, 1933. I've set the story in. But even at that, it's like, how do I approach this subject? And what I came up with, I think, was works, in the sense that I've taken parallel stories. I've taken the story of a young First Nation boy who's caught up in the system, who gets caught up in the system, and the system was a very cruel system. As you might know, the system is one in which the powers that be came into villages and took away all of the children who were 5 and 6 and 7 years old and put them in residential schools until they were 17 and 18 years old. Took them out of their families, stripped them of their culture, didn't allow them to use their language, abused them emotionally, sexually, sometimes, for, quote, all the right purposes.
Culturally, of course.
Yeah. So how do you tell that story? What I came up with was telling the story from two angles, telling the story of a gray nun, what they call the gray nuns who ran the school, this particular school at Cooper Island, and tell a story from a young nun's point of view as well as a boy's point of view. So we're getting two sides of this. And it turns out that this nun, who's from Ireland originally, comes to Canada, and she's as much in, I don't want to say quite as much, but she's caught in the system herself. She's a prisoner of her system that she's been brought up in. I know that system well. Look, what happened, stepping back from it a bit, is that back in the 1880s, Canadian government set up residential schools for seemingly all the good purposes, and that is to bring Indigenous people into the main culture and give them the tools that they might need to advance in the post-industrial revolution and so on. After setting up several schools in the 1880s and 90s, government of Canada decided that they didn't want to do the tough work that it takes. They set up trade schools and so on, but they discovered quickly that if you pass these off to religious schools, religious institutions, the Catholic Church mainly, but also the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the United Church, that they could achieve their goal, supposedly, which much less expensively, much cheaper. And when you study the history of this whole residential school, you continually get the federal government coming in and saying how much less can they spend per student, especially when we get to the point that I'm talking about in 1933 with the Depression, and they basically stripped the schools of so much of their financial backing that schools had to finance their own food, diets, and so on, and they were very meager to start with. Go ahead.
So, sorry, what are the new updates about this history? The new updates about this history you are talking?
Well, could I update it? It went on until the 1960s, 70s, even if you want to get technical about it, in 1990s, there were still some schools, residential schools functioning. But certainly in the, at the turn of the 1900s and throughout the first half of the 20th century, residential schools were rampant throughout Canada. Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. My story takes place in British Columbia.
Is there any estimation for the number of children went to these schools? Overall number, how much during that
How
time?
many? Oh, at times 50,000. I have the figures, you know, from a book, but I can't quite quote exactly the numbers now. But there were huge numbers of First Nation children in the schools. And again, if you look at a documentary like Return to Cooper Island, which was done about 25 years ago, and Peter Campbell is at this moment doing a remake of that documentary. Cooper Island, if you're not familiar with it, is right off Ladysmith, an island off south end of Thetis Island. And the school was very active throughout the 20th century. And it's a very moving documentary that's been made that a group of First Nation graduates go back to Cooper Island and recall, you know, personal histories, personal events, situations that happened to them. I have to say, I actually borrowed a bit from that documentary in my film screenplay because it was so striking and so hard. One of the difficult things in writing the screenplay is that I really had to tone it down. There are so many truly devastating stories that come out of it, you know, recorded, verified, that if I were to choose the worst of them, there would be a tendency for the viewer not to believe it, or to feel like you're just piling it on. So in a sense, from the screenwriter's point of view, my point of view, I had to very selectively choose situations that this boy gets into, or that he's caught up in, when the 6-year-old is taken away from his family and has his head shaved, and gets a number that he goes by, changes his name. None of the names were the same. They're all given Anglo names, and then taken into a system that you're literally stripped of your culture. Let me read just a touch from, and this is from 1880s, John Macdonald, Prime Minister. When a child lives in a reserve, he is surrounded by savages. His habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. I strongly believe that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence. The only way to do that is put them in residential schools where they will acquire habits and modes of thought of white men. I mean, that's from the Prime Minister. And as that is translated, throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, that became the law, in a sense, of the land, or the law that the First Nation people were under.
What struck me that terms, even the colonial settler used the term white man.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah.
You try. I completely tried to take that the matter of colors outside. It's a matter of sun. More exposed to sun, more darker skin you have. But to put people in category based on white or non-white or color or non-color. So it seems not just the victimized, colonized people see that the white man, as they say, but also the colonial settler called himself the white man as well. So
in a sense, the big unspoken secret, and it's not a secret at all, is that Canada, the United States are born in racism. It's in the DNA. It is, it's attempted to be suppressed and attempted to be bypassed and attempted to be avoided, but it's there, and it comes out in so many ways. In the 1930s, the period that my story takes place, the schools were attempting to teach the boys farming, right? Modern farm techniques, but it's against the law in 1933 for, as they say, an Indian to drive a mechanized farm vehicle. It's against the law for them to. Now you're teaching kids modern farming, but you say you can't use any of the equipment because it's against the law. I mean, these kinds of incongruities run through the whole system. The screenplay that I take, I take it from two points of view, however. I take it from a nun's point of view, who comes over, 22-year-old nun from Ireland, innocent, and she is buying into the whole thing, which we all were. I was brought up a Catholic. I was in a religious order. I was a Trappist monk for a while. I know the territory of Catholicism and the mythologies. And there was a ingrained belief that you are going to save the pagan, save the heathen, give them, Christ and everything that He has promised. I'm looking at the point of view from a young nun who arrives here, and she, in her own way, is as much a kind of a prisoner of the system as the boy is. And I have them create a relationship in the film. And I think it's quite a sympathetic one. More sympathy than the church probably deserves.
Vic, we have around maybe a minute. What is the status now of the screenplay?
Well, like a lot of screenplays, the status is still to come. I have it out. There is a production company that's shown interest in it. To get a thing done, for something to arrive on the screen is a real process. Sometimes it can happen like that. I mean, very quickly. Sometimes it's years. I think because this story is so much in the news daily, especially in Canada. You can pick up the Globe and Mail any day, and there's an article on, the church is not fulfilling their obligations in terms of money. There's something going on all of the time. So it's a vital kind of subject, And it's one, again, that documentaries can deal with, but I think a narrative film really needs a wide audience. The story needs a wide audience. It needs the emotional kind of connection that an audience gets to seeing it on the screen, big screen. So hopefully.
Thanks a lot, Beck, for this this information about this important play, and hopefully its status will be very soon as a film and for everybody to see. Again, thanks a lot, and thanks for watching the first segment of Indigenous Voice.